Something happened this week that cuts right through the noise in American politics. DHS quietly rolled out one of the most aggressive enforcement actions we've seen in years. No fanfare, no build-up, just a sudden wave of arrests. That left an entire city stunned and scrambling for answers. And while that was unfolding on the ground, a completely different shock hit the airwaves. Marjorie Taylor Greene, someone known for pushing back twice as hard as she's pushed, sat on live television and delivered an apology that nobody expected to hear. Not from her, and not in this moment of political tension. And while national headlines were locked onto that, another story erupted in Chicago. A story that's no longer just about taxes or policy disagreements, but about a community that reached its breaking point. Residents are confronting their mayor face-to-face, shutting down his events, and demanding accountability after property taxes doubled overnight. The frustration isn't quiet anymore. It's boiling, public, and impossible for city leaders to ignore. All three of these moments, DHS's sudden operation, MTG's unexpected shift in tone, and Chicago's growing revolt, aren't separate threads. They're part of one larger picture. One unmistakable sign that something deeper is happening across the country. And once you see how these events connect, you'll understand why so many Americans are saying this is the week everything changed. Let's start with the DHS update that officials hoped would stay under the radar. Over the weekend, federal immigration agents descended on Charlotte, North Carolina. Not a small operation, dozens of agents, unmarked vehicles, tactical gear. Within just a handful of hours, they had taken nearly 100 people into custody. The official statement from Border Patrol, Chief Gregory Bavino, framed it simply. These were individuals with significant criminal and immigration histories. DHS emphasized they were protecting Americans by targeting those who pose threats. But here's where it gets interesting. Charlotte isn't a border town. It's not some small rural outpost either. It's a major metropolitan area, one of the fastest growing cities in the Southeast. So when residents woke up to see federal agents conducting what looked like military-style sweeps through their neighborhoods, confusion turned to panic almost instantly. Local news crews scrambled to the scene. Community leaders organized emergency gatherings at churches, and social media exploded with videos showing agents detaining people on sidewalks, outside apartment buildings, and parking lots. The images were jarring. Masked officers, people being led away in handcuffs, families watching from windows. What struck me most wasn't just the scale of the operation. It was the disconnect between what officials were saying and what people on the ground were experiencing. DHS insisted this was targeted enforcement going after criminals, people who had already had their day in court, those with final deportation orders who'd been avoiding authorities. But residents, they saw something else entirely. One bakery owner, a man who'd been serving that community for years, told reporters he was shutting down his shop, not because of anything legal, not because business was slow. He shut down because he was terrified his customers, many of them immigrants or people of color, would be caught up in what he described as indiscriminate raids. He said he watched agents throw people to the ground without explanation. He said the fear was so thick you could feel it in the air. Think about that for a moment. Imagine running a small business knowing your livelihood depends on trust and community relationships. And then one morning the federal government shows up in force and suddenly nobody feels safe. That's not just an enforcement operation. That's a breakdown in social trust. And here's the thing. This wasn't happening in isolation. Similar operations were unfolding in cities across the country. Memphis, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago. Each city responded differently. Some mayors collaborated quietly with federal authorities, working behind closed doors to facilitate the process with minimal disruption. Others fought back publicly, accusing the administration of overreach and fear-mongering. Charlotte fell somewhere in between, which only amplified the confusion. Without clear communication from local leadership, residents filled the vacuum with anxiety and speculation. Were agents checking papers on the street? Could citizens be detained by mistake? The rumors spread faster than the facts. What made Charlotte's situation particularly volatile was the demographic makeup of the neighborhoods being targeted. These weren't wealthy suburbs. These were working-class communities, predominantly Black and Latino families, many of whom had lived there for generations. The message they received, whether intended or not, was clear. You're not safe in your own neighborhood anymore. And that divide becomes even clearer when you look at the reactions not just from residents, but from the political class trying desperately to control the narrative. Because while families were hiding in their homes and businesses were closing their doors, politicians on both sides were scrambling to frame the story. Conservatives pointed to the arrest numbers, people with warrants, criminal records, immigration violations, and said, "See, this is exactly what we voted for. Law and order restored." Progressives pointed to the fear, the chaos, the children watching their parents dragged away, and said, "See, this is the cruelty we warned you about." But the reality, as always, was more complicated, because tucked inside that complexity was a question nobody wanted to answer honestly. Why Charlotte? Local officials were baffled. Community organizers were angry. And the media, well, the media did what it does best. It spun the story to fit the narrative. CNN ran a segment questioning the logic behind targeting Charlotte at all. Their argument, crime was down, way down. A reporter stood outside City Hall citing data showing that homicides, robberies, vehicle thefts, and assaults had all dropped by double-digit percentages compared to the previous year. If crime is falling, she asked, why does the city suddenly need federal intervention? It was a compelling question. On the surface, it made sense, but dig just a little deeper and the picture gets murkier. Because while certain crime categories were indeed down compared to recent highs, the longer-term trend told a different story. Go back a few years, before the pandemic chaos and the protests and the policy shifts, and you'd see that Charlotte's crime rates had actually spiked dramatically. Property crime up significantly. Vehicle thefts more than doubled. Burglaries, assaults, arson all climbing steadily. So yes, things improved slightly year over year, but Charlotte was still dealing with elevated crime levels that hadn't existed half a decade earlier. And the types of crimes being committed, they pointed to deeper issues: organized theft rings, gang activity, drug trafficking networks, the kind of crime that federal agencies typically get involved in when local resources are overwhelmed. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The media narrative focused almost entirely on the statistics. Crime is down. Therefore, the federal response is unjustified. What they didn't talk about as much was the other layer, the immigration enforcement component. Because Charlotte, like many growing cities in the South, had become a destination for immigrants seeking work and opportunity. Some came legally, others didn't. And over the years, as the city's population diversified, so did its challenges. Schools had to adapt. Social services were stretched. And yes, some portion of the criminal activity involved people who are in the country unlawfully. That's not a controversial statement. It's just math. When you have a large undocumented population, inevitably some percentage of that population will commit crimes. The question isn't whether that's true. The question is what you do about it. And that's where the political divide becomes a chasm, because one side says we need to enforce our immigration laws. If you're here illegally and you commit a crime, you get deported. That's not cruelty. That's consequences. The other side says targeting vulnerable communities creates fear that prevents people from reporting crimes, cooperating with police, and integrating into society. That makes everyone less safe, not more. Both arguments have merit. Both are rooted in legitimate concerns, and both completely ignore the human beings caught in the middle. The bakery owner who shut his doors. He wasn't making a political statement. He was trying to protect people he cared about. The families hiding in their homes, they weren't illegal activists or criminal networks. Most of them were just people trying to live their lives caught in a system that had become so polarized, so weaponized that nobody could agree on basic facts anymore. And that conflict is exploding inside both political parties, starting with a fiery confrontation that's been building for months. While Charlotte was dealing with ICE raids, Washington was dealing with its own kind of chaos. Because just days earlier, Congress had narrowly avoided a government shutdown. It was one of those high-stakes, down-to-the-wire negotiations where everybody claims victory and nobody actually wins. In the end, a handful of Senate Democrats broke ranks and voted with Republicans to keep the government open. It was the pragmatic move, the kind of compromise that used to happen all the time before politics became blood sport. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she wasn't having it. In a scathing statement, AOC accused those Democrats of showing weakness. She said, Republicans were learning that if they just inflict enough pain on working people, Democrats will fold. She argued that caving on the shutdown signaled to the opposition that hostage-taking works, and she urged her colleagues to stand firm next time, even if it meant more hardship in the short term. It was vintage AOC defiant, uncompromising, focused on the bigger ideological battle. But not everyone agreed. Senator Tim Kaine, a moderate Democrat from Virginia, fired back publicly. He pointed out that he represents hundreds of thousands of federal workers who would have missed paychecks if the government stayed closed. He noted that real people, not abstract political principles, were at stake. And in a barely veiled jab, he said that some folks, naming AOC specifically, might think protecting those workers is nothing. But Virginians sure didn't see it that way. That kind of public infighting used to be rare. Disagreements happened, sure, but usually behind closed doors. Not anymore. The Democratic Party is fracturing along generational and ideological lines, and it's happening in real time on live TV and social media. The progressives, AOC, Bernie Sanders, the squad, they want bold action, structural change, unapologetic challenges to corporate power, and systemic inequality. The moderates can mansion a dwindling number of centrists. They want stability, incremental progress, policies that can actually pass and get implemented. And the voters, they're exhausted watching their representatives fight each other instead of solving problems. But here's what struck me most about that exchange. Tim Kaine mentioned something in passing that didn't get much attention, but it should have. He said he doesn't tell House members who to pick as their leader because he's got a full-time job being a senator. He doesn't freelance. Opinions about House leadership, simply meaning stay in your lane, focus on your job, stop grandstanding. It was a rebuke not just of AOC's tactics, but of the performative nature of modern politics, where being loud matters more than being effective. And just when you thought the Democratic Civil War was the main story, something even stranger happened. Because while Democrats were tearing each other apart over government funding, Republicans were dealing with their own earthquake. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the firebrand congresswoman from Georgia, known for never backing down, never apologizing, never showing an ounce of doubt, went on CNN and did exactly that. She started her appearance by saying she wanted to end toxic politics. That alone should have been a red flag. MTG talking about civility is like a shark discussing vegetarianism. But she kept going. She said the divisive rhetoric, the name calling, the personal attacks, all of it was tearing the country apart and needed to stop. And then she dropped the bombshell. She said President Trump had called her a traitor, that he had used language that could radicalize people against her and put her life in danger. Let that sink in for a second. One of Trump's most loyal defenders, someone who'd stood by him through every controversy, every scandal, every legal battle. She was now publicly accusing him of endangering her safety. The CNN host looked stunned. The audience, watching at home, were stunned. And political insiders on both sides immediately started dissecting what it meant. Was this a genuine moment of self-reflection? A strategic repositioning ahead of her next election? A calculated move to distance herself from Trump as his legal troubles mounted? Or was it something else? Entirely a reaction to being sidelined, to losing influence, to realizing the MAGA movement was moving on without her? Nobody had a definitive answer. But what happened next made the situation even more complicated. Because MTG didn't stop with the apology. She pivoted almost immediately to her real agenda, the Epstein files. She said that this whole controversy had been reduced to questions about those sealed documents, that powerful people were being protected, that the American people deserved transparency, that she stood with survivors and victims, and she wasn't going to apologize for demanding the truth. Now here's where it gets fascinating from a strategic standpoint. Whether you agree with her politics or not, you have to admire the move. She just spent 5 minutes talking about ending toxic rhetoric and healing divisions, and then she immediately jumped to one of the most inflammatory, conspiracy-adjacent topics in American politics. But here's the thing. She wasn't wrong about the public interest. Poll after poll showed that massive majorities of Americans across party lines wanted more transparency about Epstein's connections. They wanted to know who was on those flights, who visited that island, who knew what and when. It's one of those rare issues where the populist left and populist right actually agree. The elites are hiding something. The system protects the powerful, and until those files are fully released, trust in institutions will continue eroding. So MTG tapped into something real, something that resonates with millions of people who feel like they're being lied to by people in authority. And whether her motives were pure or calculated, doesn't really matter because the conversation shifted. Suddenly, instead of talking about her apology or her relationship with Trump, people were sharing memes about Epstein, where one in particular went viral, a darkly humorous exchange where someone says, "The Epstein list needs to be released," and another person responds that doing so would destabilize the world, put a huge portion of Congress and global leaders in prison, and cause society to collapse. And the first person replies, "I already said I'm for it. You don't have to sell it to me." Gallows humor. Sure, but it captured the mood perfectly. People are so fed up, so disillusioned that they'd rather see the whole system burn than continue pretending everything's fine. The CNN host tried to steer the interview back to safer ground, asking MTG about her legislative priorities, her committee work, the standard political questions. But MTG wasn't done because then she said something that created an entirely new controversy. She started talking about foreign influence. She asked out loud on national television whether a foreign government might be pressuring Trump to keep the FCN files sealed, and she showed a graphic on screen, a chart detailing donations from AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobbying group, to various congressional candidates. The host's jaw practically hit the floor. She immediately pushed back, asking MTG point blank, "Are you saying Israel is controlling the president? Are you accusing a foreign government of covering up the Epstein scandal? What evidence do you have?" MTG tried to backpedal, sort of. She said she was just asking questions, that it could be any foreign government, that people deserve transparency about who's influencing American policy. But the damage was done. The implication was clear. And look, this is where things get uncomfortable, because criticism of Israeli government policy or lobbying influence or foreign aid, that's all fair game in a democracy. But the way she framed it, the context she used, the specific connections she drew, it tapped into old, ugly conspiracy theories that have caused real harm to real people throughout history. You can demand transparency about Epstein's associates without implying that a shadowy foreign power is pulling strings behind the scenes. You can question lobbying influence without singling out one particular country in a way that echoes anti-Semitic tropes. And the fact that MTG either didn't see the problem or didn't care tells you something important about the state of political discourse right now. Nuance is dead. Context doesn't matter. It's all about saying the most provocative thing possible and letting the chips fall where they may. But here's what struck me most. Political analysts across the spectrum, including some who are generally sympathetic to her views, said the same thing. If you're going to make that kind of accusation, you need to say it clearly and back it up with evidence. Don't hint, don't insinuate. Either make the case or don't bring it up. Because vague conspiracy theories don't hold anyone accountable. They just poison the well and make it harder to have honest conversations about real issues like lobbying reform, campaign finance, or foreign policy. And while Washington was battling over words and implications, and apologies that may or may not have been sincere, Chicago was battling over something much more tangible: survival. If you've been following the news out of Chicago over the past year, you know it's been rough. Crime, budget shortfalls, schools closing, neighborhoods declining. But what happened recently took things to a whole new level. Property taxes in Chicago just went up. Not a little, not 5 or 10%. In some neighborhoods they doubled, as in 100% increases. Families opened their tax bills and saw numbers they couldn't believe. In North Lawndale, a historically black neighborhood on the city's west side, the average property tax bill jumped by ranges approaching or exceeding 100%. In West Garfield Park, median increases hit ranges near 130% or more. These are communities that have struggled for decades with disinvestment, abandonment, neglect, and now, just as some stabilization was starting to happen, the city hits them with tax bills that many families simply cannot afford. Think about what that means in practical terms. You're a homeowner. You bought your house years ago, maybe inherited it from your parents. You've been paying your taxes, maintaining your property, trying to build a little equity, and then overnight your tax bill doubles. If you're living on a fixed income Social Security, maybe a small pension, that kind of increase can wipe out your entire budget. You're suddenly choosing between keeping